Hello, my name is Craig Nesson. I serve on the faculty of Wartburg Theological Seminary in Dubuque, Iowa. And this podcast is focusing on an amazing project to bring 100 students from Namibia to study at ELCA colleges and universities in relation to the freedom struggle and the nation building in Namibia at the southern tip of Africa. This podcast is produced in relationship to the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America Companion Synod program, especially for those synods that are relators to Namibia, and also by the Wartburg Theological Seminary Namibian Archives. And our conversation is with Dr. Jim Unglaube, and he was part of this miracle that happened in relationship to the freedom struggle and the nation building in Namibia. So Jim, thank you very much for agreeing to be a part of this podcast. And I'm wondering if we could begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your career.
Happy to, and happy to do this podcast. I'm retired and living in the Twin Cities. I spent my entire career working in Lutheran higher education, 10 years at Lenore Rhine College, former LCA, now ELCA College in North Carolina, and 20 years on churchwide staff in higher education, 10 at the LCA and 10 at the ELCA. And then the last 10 years, plus 10 more in retirement, doing development work, fundraising at Carthage College in Kenosha, Wisconsin, which is also my alma mater.
Thank you. So can you give us a little background about Namibia?
Sure, glad to. And I might begin by saying part of the reason for doing this is because I think that most people, like myself, if I were to think about Namibia prior to 1980, I don't think I would have heard of what was then Southwest Africa or could have pointed to it on the map. I didn't know much about Africa, and I think we generally don't. But you know, Africa is 4 times the size of the United States. You could fit the US in it 4 times. And down at the southern end of the continent is South Africa, which cuts all the way across the continent at the bottom. And then just north of it on the Atlantic coast is the country that is now called Namibia, named after the Namib Desert, which is a geographical spectacle in that country. It has a very kind of unique history. German missionaries came to then Southwest Africa in the mid 1800s, 1842. German missionaries came, and they weren't able to cover the whole country. So as I understand it, they kind of invited the Finnish church in Europe to send missionaries as well. And so the Germans took the south and middle of the country, and the Finns took the north of the country. And so kind of 2 streams of Lutheranism developed in that country as their evangelism efforts brought a significant portion of the Southwest African population into Lutheranism. And then later in the 19th century, the German government came to Namibia. There had been German settlers that had come because Southwest Africa is rich in minerals. And those early settlers encouraged the government to come because of uprisings that were taking place between those German settlers and the native peoples of the country. And so Germany came as a country later in the 19th century, and between 1884 and 1915, it was a German colony. Germany had several colonies in Africa, and this was one of them. But as World War I came along, Germany lost its colonies. In the case of Southwest Africa, the South Africans themselves pushed Germany out, and the League of Nations kind of, if you will, gave Southwest Africa to South Africa to take care of, I think with the intention that ultimately it would be freed and given its independence. But I think South Africa got used to kind of being in charge because it was a nation wealthy in minerals, and so they kept it, and they kept it for a long time. And when apartheid came to South Africa in the middle of the 20th century, apartheid came to Southwest Africa as well. So what we now know as Namibia lived under apartheid for somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50 years. And I don't think I need to say anything about what apartheid was like. It was evil. And I got to be in Namibia, Southwest Africa, first 5 times, I guess, before its independence. So I got to experience apartheid, and it is indeed evil. So that's probably more of an answer than you were looking for. And
No,
leads
many of us became first familiar with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Right. And only subsequently did we discover that this system was also oppressing the Namibian, who are now the Namibian people of at that time Southwest Africa. And it was a terrible system of separation and oppression and extraction of wealth from the population.
It was indeed, and the population of Southwest Africa / Namibia is overwhelmingly Black. So the white population in that country was and is tiny, 5% or so. So that when you were in the country, even under apartheid, most of the time, unless you were in the capital of Windhoek, you were not among white folks, because the white folks were concentrated. They owned most of the land, but Namibia, for anyone that's ever been there, is familiar with the fact that it's basically a desert country. And so the land itself is not productive, very productive agriculturally, but it's extremely rich in minerals. And experiencing apartheid in Namibia was a little bit different than experiencing apartheid, for example, in Johannesburg, in a big city, where the white population would have had a larger presence. But I can still remember walking down the streets in the capital, this beautiful city of Windhoek, and walking down the sidewalk as a white person. And if some Namibian Black folks were approaching me during the apartheid time, they'd step aside. They'd step into the street in order to get out of my way, whether I asked for it or not. It was just one of those things that you experienced as part of this terrible, terrible system. And in the northern part of the country, which is very poor and barren in terms of the land, hospital, a great hospital up there, didn't have any doctors, because there weren't any Black doctors in the country, and the only doctors that could come were doctors that were trained in South Africa, and they didn't want to be there. And so it was just a devilish kind of thing to experience.
It's unimaginable, really, the degree of the suffering of people under that system. I wanted to ask you, did the colonial system also affect the churches in Namibia? Are some of those colonial histories still clear in the way the church is organized?
Yeah, it is. Just a half a step back, part of what happened during the apartheid era, beginning in the German colonial era, is the the tribal peoples in Namibia, there's half a dozen or so tribes, long time tribes in Namibia, were separated and pushed out into various parts of the country, kind of conquering by dividing. And during the German colonial era, two of the tribes resisted that separation and entered into conflict. And the German, there's no other way to describe it except that the Germans committed genocide. So it's a sad story for which the Germans have only recently fully apologized and actually made some reparations. But anyway, when the Germans and the Finns came into the country, the German church was concentrated, as I said, in the middle and south of the country, around the capital of Windhoek, and included primarily a couple of Namibian tribes. It also included a category of people, language that I would never use here in this country, except to use language they still use, and that's the colored population, the people that were of mixed race, for obvious reasons. They were part of the church that the German missionaries established, and that church still exists, has 400,000 members. The Finns, on the other hand, were in the north of the country, along the Angolan border, where the population of the country is concentrated, ironically, in a very barren part of the country. And the Finns established another church up there. When it began, it was called the Evangelical Ovambo Kavango Lutheran Church. Ovambo Kavango were the names of two of the tribes that were concentrated in the north. That church has 700,000 to 800,000 members. And if you look at Lutheran populations of Lutherans in countries around the world, Namibia would have one of the highest percentage populations of Lutherans. Somewhere it has slipped some in recent years, but it's close to 50% of the population of that country are Lutheran, which you simply wouldn't expect. Another fact people don't recognize is that two of the four largest Lutheran church bodies in the world are in Africa, in Tanzania and Ethiopia. But anyway, these two churches established by the German and Finnish missionaries are still separate, ironically. And I don't know all the details of it, except that at the time I was spending time in Namibia, the Finnish church, in terms of its practice, was more conservative than the German church. And I think that kind of kept them apart. And then the third piece is a small, very small, 5,000 members or so, white German Lutheran church body that's focused in Windhoek. There's this beautiful old church building on a circle in the center of the city, which is kind of a landmark, which is a German Lutheran church. My understanding, I've never been in it, and blacks did not like to go in it because the stained glass windows paid homage to Germans who took part in the wars that when genocide happened. And they are, however, the three bodies, the white church and the two large black churches, are members of a council of churches. So at least they're able to sit around a table as an ecumenical body, which is, I guess we'd say, a step forward. I would have expected by now they're 35 years into independence, that maybe those two churches, big churches, would have come together, but they haven't yet. And maybe they never will, I don't know. Look how long it took for Lutherans in the US to come together.
That's a good comparison.
Yeah.
Can you take us back to have some context about the struggle for independence and how that unfolded?
I can. The struggle for independence actually began way back in 1960, when an organization known as the Southwest African People's Organization was formed. SWAPO, it was called. It was led by a man named Sam Nujoma. And it was concentrated outside of the country significantly in Angola to the north. And they were a resistance movement. And for years and years, there was a resistance movement that was peaceful, but they weren't making any progress. And in 1966, they entered into conflict. So between 1966 and 1990, that's what, 24 years, there was armed conflict taking place in an effort to gain freedom. And those SWAPO militants would come into the country from the north, from Angola. And what it means is that most of the conflict in the war took place along the northern border of what is now Namibia. So that Ovambo, Kavango Church, those two tribes, that part of the country is the part that suffered the most during the war. And I was going up there annually for the last 5 years before independence, had to get special permission to enter that zone. It was actually fenced off. You had to go through a security checkpoint. And I would fly up sometimes, and when the planes started flying in that security zone, they would drop down and fly at treetop levels because they were concerned that somebody might shoot at them. That's not a very comforting way to fly, I might add. So in 1966, it became an armed conflict and went on all the way until 1990 when Namibia finally gained its independence. And there was 1 year, the year would have been 1989-90, when the United Nations was present in Namibia and served as kind of a buffer as they moved into independence. I was there that year as well. It was amazing to see the difference in the country, even in that intermediate year. And then I was there a number of times after independence, and this little story I told you about walking down the street after independence, you walk down the street and nobody stepped aside for you anymore. They were proud people, and they weren't angry or anything about it. They were equals with everybody else. It was just one of those things that I noticed as I was there.
Well, I think it's really amazing to have you as kind of an eyewitness through your several trips to Namibia to these years of struggle for independence, and then in the turn toward nation building after the independence in 1990.
Yeah, I never would have dreamed in my life that I would have spent as much time as I did in Africa. I've been to Namibia. Haven't counted, probably 15 times over the years, and then have traveled in other parts of Africa as well. It's just beyond my wildest imagination. And this experience with students I've had a wonderful career, but I look back on those years as kind of the high point of my professional life.
So how did the idea emerge and evolve about bringing these students to study in the U.S. at Lutheran colleges and universities?
Well, it arose for us in the 1980s, so in the latter years of the struggle for independence. And by that time, Lutherans and non-Lutherans too, kind of all over the world through the UN and other bodies were, taking up voice for independence. South Africa was really sitting out there all by itself because of apartheid, and in parallel, I guess you could say, independence for Namibia. And I was in the higher education office of the Lutheran Church in America in New York at the time. And the American Lutheran Church at that time was here in Minneapolis. And even though we were two different church bodies, our colleges are so similar that almost everything our two higher education offices did, we did together. So we knew our colleagues in the ELCA in Minneapolis very well. They were dear friends, and a woman there, Naomi Linnell, no longer alive, and I don't know, maybe we were sitting down over a beer somewhere, I can't remember, had this idea that, all this advocacy is taking place for independence. Here we have these colleges, how might we take part? We could have just, pumped up advocacy, and some of that did take place. but we had this bright idea, why don't we bring some students over to the US? And somehow we settled in on the number 1,000. And part of the reason that that idea emerged is because under apartheid, very few Southwest African kids got to go to high school. There were each of the two Black Lutheran church bodies had a high school, a residential high school. They were the two best high schools for those students in the country. And very few kids got to go to high school at all. And there was nowhere for any of them to go to college unless they left and went to South Africa or somewhere else. There was no college for the Black students in the country. And so the notion of, maybe we could bring 100 of them over to the US and provide them with an education that might be helpful as that independent country we hoped would be emerging. So we had this bright idea, two of us sitting in these offices in the US. We didn't have a penny to our names to do this. So we began to think how. Well, the first job was to convince, through conversation, the presidents of these colleges to accept these students. And acceptance meant giving them full scholarships. As I say, we didn't have any money. And that's a big ask. And almost all the colleges accepted. There were a couple that chose not to take part. But the way it worked best for the colleges was that because most of them took part, any college only needed to enroll 4, 5, 6 students. And they didn't all come at the same time. They came over 6 years. So a college might take 6, but they'd be taking 1 a year. So they could spread them out in terms of the impact on their finances. Well, that took care of part of it, but we still had to get them here. And we had to provide them with some kind of a stipend that would pay for their books and life, clothing and everything else that kids spend money on when they go to college. And in the office in New York where I worked, in those days, because we weren't one church, the ELCA, the Lutheran World Federation actually had an office in the US that worked with these two church bodies. And a friend who worked in that office suggested that we ought to go to Germany and see if we could find support. And quite different than here in the US, in Germany, at least in those days, in the 80s, your income tax, as I understand it, was 10% of your income. That 10%, 1/10 of it, was called a church tax. So 1% of your income, a tenth of that tax, was called a church tax. Everybody paid it at that time. Tax still exists, but you can opt out of it somehow. I don't know quite how. So they pay a church tax, and they do with the church tax the kind of stuff that our churches here would do with money out of that. You remember the 3-part envelopes we used to have in the old days? One was benevolence. And it was that benevolence slot in the envelope. That's the money that the church tax was gathering. And they created what, in my mind, in America would look like a foundation. The German government did, to distribute that money to do good. They were doing benevolent work, but it was being done in an entirely different channel through the government. And we were encouraged to go to that organization. It was called the Evangelische Zentralstellung für Entwicklungshilfe. The Germans.
About what year was that?
1985. Germans, string words together to make very long words. So I went to Europe. I did that myself, and went through Geneva and stopped at LWF and went to this office in Bonn in Germany and had a conversation with the fellow that was in charge. And miracle of miracles, they said yes. And it was never expressed. I have a sense of why they said yes, partly because maybe it was a little bit of reparations under a different word. And some might have thought, well, why would Germany pay all this money to send kids to go to college in the US? Why not bring them to Germany? Well, the fact is that the official language in Namibia is English, so that these kids would come to the US and not have to learn a language to be able to go to school. That was a great advantage. So they gave us money to cover those costs, travel and books and expenses. And it was about $2.5 million. That was in 1985 dollars. Today it would probably be somewhere around 5 million, I suppose. I don't know. I've never tried to figure out exactly what its equivalent would be. You know, if you were to figure out what all that tuition and room and board cost the colleges and what this grant did, it was probably a $10 million. And the fact that any piece of it worked, I still think of it all these years later as something of a miracle. So when we got that kind of clearance, first year I went to Namibia, we weren't bringing students yet. We were carrying the message of this idea to the church leaders. We didn't deal with the government in Namibia or South Africa. We dealt with the church leaders.
What tremendous international collaboration, though, went into this.
Yeah,
I mean, it did. Everything just had to fall into place.
It did. And one of the things I'll never quite understand, the mere fact that this program took place and South Africa allowed these students to come out of Namibia and come to the US was an embarrassment. Should have been an embarrassment to South Africa, but they let them come. And, you know, and they would be coming home as leaders and to a country where South Africa, you know, hoped they'd have a control there forever and probably didn't particularly want any leaders. They wanted people that were passive. So the fact that South Africa allowed it to happen is even a surprise.
How did you select the students?
Well, that's a good story too. You know, I don't think we planned it this way, but it was a bit of genius, even if it was unplanned genius. And that is, actually, Naomi and I made the decisions about which colleges these kids would attend. So we divvied them up among the colleges, but we allowed the churches in Namibia to select the students. So we had nothing to do with who the 100 were. And we simply divvied them up and said 50 to each church. Probably we should have not quite made it equal because one church was twice as large as the other. But we said 50-50, and the bishops of those churches and their assistants were involved in identifying those students, and they did a remarkable job. It would have been easy for them to, you know, play favorites and who they chose. And there was a little bit of that. You know, an assistant to the bishop's child might have come, but by and large, they knew that they were going to be sending these kids into challenging situations educationally. Their ability to be able to make it at these colleges, they sent the best, and I give them credit for that. And the other thing that they all went home when the program was conceived, and we were selling it to our colleges. One of the questions that would come up when we talked to the presidents is a hesitancy on their part, I guess, would be, well, you know, they're going to come over here and go to college and they're going to stay. They don't want to go back home. And, you know, we said, no, we don't think so. We had no proof that they'd go home, but we said, we think this is different. I think one thing that made that even more likely to happen, that they would go home, is independence came right smack in the middle of this program. So it was something to draw them home. In fact, the independence celebration was in the middle of an academic year, and those students begged us to send them home for the celebration. We didn't have the money to do it, and we didn't do it. But they wanted to be there for that celebration. I have a poster hanging up on my wall right here in front of me that I'm looking at from a concert that took place in March of 1990. It was a big concert in Windhoek celebrating independence. I didn't get to it, but I've got a poster. They all went home, and Bishop Dumani, who was the bishop of the church in the north at the time this program was going on. It's an emotional thing for me to repeat, even though I've repeated it 100 times. is he would sit with these students. I would go every year to meet with the students and tell them where they were going to school. And he would meet with them with me, and he would say something. And he would say, these scholarships have been given to the people of Namibia, not to you. Now, if I'd heard that, maybe not as an 18-year-old, if I hear it now, I think, you darn well better come home. They heard it, I think, and they all came home. And there were a couple of exceptions. A couple of the women students fell in love, happens in college. But ultimately, I believe all of them ended up back home, maybe a couple of them, not immediately. So that too is part of this kind of miracle story. And they returned, you can say, well, a country of a couple million people, so you educated 100, a drop in the bucket. Well, the fact is they came back to a country that had no college. So none of these kids there had gone to college. A brand new independent country that was would be searching for people to step into leadership roles. You know, the transition from colonial rule to independence all across Africa has been a struggle over the years. And part of it is, I believe, because there wasn't anybody prepared to step into those important roles. And these kids came home and they had opportunities right out of college that we would be accustomed to experiencing, you know, halfway through our careers, because there wasn't anybody else to do it. A little footnote to that story. About the time I started going over there in the mid 80s, out of the brightness of the minds of the South Africans, they decided to build a university in Namibia for the whites. So they built this brand new campus on the outskirts of Windhoek. It was going to be a university for the white population, this tiny white population in Namibia. Well, they got it done just at the time independence came. So again, a miracle happened, and that was independence came, and the new Namibia did not have to build a university campus. They had the campus; they could start a university immediately, and they did. And now it's got a law school and it's got a medical school, and so something else that just kind of worked out right in this transition.
Jim, can you tell us a little bit about the student experiences at when they were studying at the colleges and universities?
Well, one thing we learned, at least I learned, and that is some folks might assume that students coming from Africa would naturally relate to African American students on a campus. That's not necessarily the case. It's not terribly important, but they were accepted warmly. In many of the cases, the colleges set up host families that helped make the transition. The churches were involved, so that they weren't quite so lonely and isolated. And they thrived. They did fine in college. None of them failed out. Another little footnote, you know, most of our colleges, at least then, they don't so much anymore, required kids when they came to college to study a foreign language. Now, what do we do with these 100? The college, I don't know how the colleges all dealt with it, but there was a young woman who came from the north. She happened to be a Roman Catholic. Angola, just to the north, was a Portuguese colony, and it was Catholic. And she spoke Afrikaans, the language only spoken in South Africa and Namibia. She spoke English. She spoke German. She spoke Portuguese. If this program wouldn't have existed, she would have been deprived of a college education, but she was quadrilingual. Now she comes to the US. Do you tell her to take a foreign language? She already had 4 languages. I think most of the colleges waived it and didn't force them to take Spanish or something. It was just one of the little pieces. But they fit in well, and we would, when they came the first time, when they arrived in the US, they flew into Chicago, and so we bused them up to the Carthage campus, which is in Kenosha, the closest campus, for a week, to kind of give them a group orientation to the new setting in the US. And then after a week, it was time to send them into the orientation programs at the colleges that were receiving them. I think that helped a bit to make them comfortable. And of course, by the second, third year, they would have other Namibians on the campus where they were going, although they didn't necessarily all know each other. And I think that helped too. Another anecdote that I always recall, we had a woman that worked in the office with us that managed all of the bookkeeping that needed to be done for this program. And when these kids would arrive in Chicago, we would have a school bus there to take them up to Kenosha. The woman that worked in the office, her husband drove the school bus, and it was parked there at the luggage claim area at O'Hare. And these kids would come out with their suitcases, a lot of suitcases, because they were, bringing, it wasn't for 1 week. And they'd bring them out to the bus, and he would take the suitcases and put them in the bus. And these kids were dumbfounded that a white guy would take their luggage and put it in the bus for them. Another one, it was kind of like walking down the sidewalk in Windhoek. It's one of those eye-opening experiences. And just the trip itself, if you can imagine, I'm sure virtually all of these 100 students had never been out of their country. They had to fly from Windhoek to Johannesburg to Europe. The flight may have stopped in Nairobi. They may have even had changed planes in Nairobi, Kenya. They flew to Amsterdam, and then they flew to Chicago by themselves. Nobody was accompanying them. They had to figure it out. I mean, these kids, particularly the kids that lived in the northern part of Namibia, really, they were living in the boonies compared to what they were going to experience on this trip. But they got there. They managed to pull it off. And so then I say, after a week in Kenosha, they were sent off to their campuses, and then we left it to the campuses. But then every summer after that, when the new students would come to Kenosha, the new group, we would bring the students that were already in the US back to Kenosha as well, so that the students that were already here could help orient the ones that were coming. The other thing we built into the program was we sent them home after 2 years. So they got a summer at home, which is pretty unusual for kids studying internationally. That was part of what the money from Germany helped to pay for. So it's just lots of miracles.
It's a miracle upon miracle.
It is. And then
what did they study? Did they have particular courses of study that were prescribed?
Nothing was prescribed. Some people might have thought, well, we were, this was the church bringing students over. We were bringing students over to go to seminary. Well, that was not part of our plan. We were bringing students over to study, to get a bachelor's degree and go home and serve, as lay members in their country. So they studied whatever they wanted to, and they studied everything. Amazingly, some of them majored in the sciences. The schools that the South Africans made available to those students at home in high school, the few public high schools, they didn't teach them math and science because the assumption was they didn't need it, because when they finished high school, they were just going to go back to serving in a subservient role in that society anyway. So these kids that came over here had little or no math or science background, but a number of them studied in the sciences. We have a young man, the only marriage that took place between students that came in the program, a woman who went to Carthage and a man who went to Luther, married each other. He's a medical doctor, OBGYN in Windhoek. His wife is studying for a PhD right now, later in her life, at the university in Windhoek in education. One of the students who went to Pacific Lutheran became the country's ambassador to the United Nations. He's now out of that role and back. He's serving in international relations at home. A woman became the ambassador to Sweden. There's a 5-nation import-export cooperative among 5 nations in Southern Africa, and that work together. The offices are in Windhoek. The offices are led by a woman who was in our program. Wow. I sat in her office one day when I was there, And she pointed up to 5 pictures on the wall. And there were the pictures of the 5 presidents. She said, those are my bosses, presidents of the 5 countries. That happened in 2017, after the program was long over. I went back to Windhoek. It was the year of the LWF assembly in Namibia. You think about that, in 2017, the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, where did they go to celebrate that? LWF went to Africa, bless their hearts. And I had the bright idea, another bright idea, very shortly before that event, that wouldn't it be nice to hold a reception in Windhoek at LWF for the students that we could get there, the ones that live close by, and a lot of them live in the Windhoek area now. And so I did, and Bishop Eaton of the ELCA, who wouldn't have known much about the program, she was a parish pastor in Ohio at the time, was there. The German bishops were there, which I thought was really special to have them there. The Namibian bishops were there, and about 30 of these students and their spouses, and some cases their families were there, just to have a reunion and kind of celebrate, you know, that now 30 years later, we could look back on this miracle, if you will. So it's a great story. There's a kid, I call them kids, they're in their 50s. One of them ran the railroads in Namibia. One of them ran the post office. When I was there in 2017, one of them was running the De Beers office in Namibia. Now, De Beers may not ring a bell to everybody, but anybody who knows anything about diamonds knows that De Beers is diamonds. And Namibia is rich in diamonds. He's running the office in Windhoek for De Beers. While I was there visiting him, he took me into the room where they're cutting and polishing diamonds. So that's the kind of experiences that they stepped into, and all kinds of others. I took a group of faculty from the colleges over there after the program was done, just to visit people who had gotten to know these students. And one place we went was, there's a safari park there, which I had not frequented much when I was going in earlier years. And we went, and turned out the naturalist there, we didn't know it, but the naturalist there, young man, was one of our students who had studied biology and done some advanced study in biology. And there he was, welcoming travelers to the park and showing off his country. So,
you know, I was familiar with the Namibian struggle since my time as a seminary student at Wartburg Seminary in the 1970s. We had a seminary student actually who was doing a PhD in Dubuque at the Aquinas Institute for Theology. And it was because of hearing about his struggle and his story, he and Selma, his wife, this is Abasai Shayavali and Selma,
I've met them.
we were among those who launched the Namibia Concerns movement here at Wartburg Seminary. Our teachers and fellow students were involved on the front end of that. It became a very significant advocacy movement. But until this year, I had never heard about this miracle with the 100 students. So I'm so grateful for you sharing this story, and wonder if you have other reflections that you would give us in conclusion.
Well, you mentioned Shayavali. The church in the north continues to grow, got big enough. They were led by just a single bishop, 800,000 people, you know, and they decided they needed to divide that church in two and have 2 bishops, and then have one bishop over the 2. So they ended up with 3 bishops instead of 1. Well, the senior bishop that oversaw the whole operation was Chekatamba Nambala. He may still be serving. I first met Chekatamba here in the US when I think he was studying at Luther and doing graduate work at Luther, but he was a pastor from the Northern Church in Namibia. And when I would get up to the north, when the war was going on, it was a very strange feeling, because I was amidst basically, you know, kind of the lone white person among a black population and in a war zone. And the war story in Namibia is it's demonic because South Africa needed foot soldiers to fight this war. Um, the officers in the South African army that were there in Namibia were white. The foot soldiers who were shooting the rifles were black. Many of them were Namibians, who the South Africans enlisted to fight a war against their own people. And after the war was over, they had to find a way to reconcile with each other. But it was also the case up there in the north that the resistance movement, SWAPO, was fighting we would call it a guerrilla war, I guess, wandering through the bush with rifles. South Africa had much more advanced weapons. And so they were kind of shooting past each other sometimes. But I stayed in the guest apartment up there. The church headquarters were right there. And on one of my visits, I heard rockets flying over the top of me coming from outside the country, I believe, being shot by SWAPO into South African military sites. And there was a German doctor who was served there. A fine hospital was right there as well, church hospital. And it was being served by a German doctor, the only doctor they would trust. I was having dinner with them one night in their little house and could hear rifle fire outside. So it was a strange feeling. I've told my family since I don't think my life insurance would have held if something would happen to me. Never crossed my mind then. But
Well, Jim, I'm so grateful for you to share these memories and these reflections on what truly was a miracle of this international cooperation, given leadership by those of us in the ELCA, what became the ELCA, and you and Naomi were miracle workers on behalf of the rebuilding of that country through this educational program.
Thank you.
So we're very, very grateful for your sharing this story, and look forward to sharing this podcast with others so they also can participate in knowing about this miracle.
Glad to have done it. It brings back good memories for me. You just press a button and I talk about it.